The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was silent for the first time in 3 decades. Ambassador Linda Morrison stood at the human podium with her hands clasped behind her back. Her face showed no emotion as she looked across the vast circular room at the representatives of 47 alien species. Some of them had been her friends once. Some had shared meals with her and told her stories of their home worlds. Now they all stared at her with confusion and growing concern written across their various features. Linda took a breath and began to speak. Her voice was calm and measured, carrying clearly through the translation devices that every species wore. Earth was withdrawing from the Galactic Council effective immediately. All human diplomatic personnel would be recalled within 24 hours. All human embassies across Council space would close. All trade agreements were hereby suspended. All military cooperation would cease. Humanity was severing every tie that bound them to the Council, and there would be no further discussion on the matter. The chamber erupted into chaos before she even finished speaking. The Xanthari Empress rose from her crystalline throne and her voice boomed through the hall demanding an explanation. The Crolian trade minister began shouting about economic treaties and the billions of credits that hung in the balance. A dozen other voices joined in, some angry, some pleading, all confused. Linda stood perfectly still and waited for the noise to die down. When it did not, she simply turned and walked toward the exit. Her delegation of 12 humans fell into step behind her. They moved as one unit, their faces blank, their steps synchronized. Not one of them looked back at the chaos they were leaving behind. The massive doors of the chamber slid open and they walked through. The doors closed behind them with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the entire station. In the viewing gallery above the chamber, dozens of species who had come to watch the routine council session were now pressing against the transparent walls trying to understand what had just happened. Journalists activated their recording devices and began speaking rapidly into them. This was not a normal diplomatic protest or a negotiation tactic. This was something unprecedented in the history of the Council. Linda and her team walked through the corridors of the station without speaking. Other humans they passed fell into step with them. Scientists who had been working in the research wings, traders who had been negotiating deals in the commerce sector, military liaisons who had been coordinating defense strategies. Every human on the station seemed to know that something was happening, and they all moved toward the docking bays. The station security tried to stop them at first. A Eularian guard stepped in front of Linda and asked her to wait for clearance from the Council. She looked at him with tired eyes and told him to step aside. The guard hesitated. Behind Linda, 300 humans had gathered and more were coming. The guard stepped aside. The humans continued walking. In the docking bay, human ships were already powering up their engines. Cargo was being loaded at triple the normal speed. Families with children moved quickly but without panic toward their assigned vessels. This had been planned down to the smallest detail. Everyone knew their role and everyone executed it perfectly. The Council Security Chief arrived at the docking bay and demanded that all human ships remain grounded until the Council could convene an emergency session. Linda turned to face him and her voice was ice cold when she spoke. Earth had made its decision and nothing the Council could say would change it. The security chief threatened to disable the ships. Linda reminded him that such an action would be considered an act of war, and humanity would respond accordingly. The security chief backed down. The first wave of human ships launched within an hour of Linda's announcement. They formed up in a defensive pattern outside the station and waited. More ships launched. Within 3 hours, every human had evacuated the Council station. The fleet numbered over 200 vessels ranging from small personal transports to massive cargo haulers. They hung in space like a swarm of silver insects waiting for the signal to move. Throughout Council space, the same scene was playing out. On the Xanthari homeworld, the human embassy staff burned their documents and sealed their database cores before boarding their shuttle. On the Crolian trade hub, human merchants closed their shops and transferred their assets to encrypted accounts. On the frontier worlds where humans and aliens had lived side by side for decades, the humans packed up their lives and headed for the nearest transport. The Council tried desperately to reach someone, anyone who could explain what was happening. They sent messages to Earth but received no response. They attempted to contact human colony worlds, but every transmission was ignored. Human military vessels that had been patrolling the border regions began pulling back into human territory. automated defense platforms that humans had helped build suddenly went active along the border and locked onto any non-human ship that approached. Within 48 hours of Linda's announcement, every human in Council space had returned home. The border between human territory and Council space became an impenetrable wall. Ships that tried to cross it were met with warning shots and stern orders to turn back. Diplomatic couriers were turned away. Trade vessels were refused entry. The silence from human space was absolute. The Council convened an emergency session to discuss the crisis. The Empress of the Zenthari spoke first, and her voice was filled with barely controlled fury. She demanded to know what had provoked this extreme response. The Crolian representative suggested that humans were simply being emotional and would calm down after a few weeks. The Eularian diplomat proposed sending a military escort to force a dialogue. Each suggestion was more desperate than the last. Deep in the intelligence wing of the Council station, analysts were pulling up every record of human diplomatic interactions from the past 30 years. They were looking for the moment when things went wrong. They were searching for the insult or the slight that had triggered this response. What they found was more troubling than any single incident. They found a pattern of dismissal and condescension that stretched back decades. They found proposals from humanity that had been ignored. They found requests for aid that had been denied. They found evidence that the Council had never truly treated humans as equals despite granting them membership. But it was too late for regrets. The damage was done. Humanity had closed its doors, and the galaxy was left to wonder what would come next. In the empty human quarter of the Council station, lights flickered off one by one until only darkness remained. Director Cavro sat in his office surrounded by holographic screens displaying decades of diplomatic records. His 6 arms moved rapidly across different control panels as he sorted through mountains of data. The insectoid intelligence chief had been given one task by the Council, and that task consumed every moment of his time now. He needed to understand why humanity had abandoned them, and he needed to understand it quickly. The first reports on his desk were economic analyses. Human trade routes had connected 17 major sectors and reduced shipping times by nearly half in some regions. Their medical technology had saved billions of lives across dozens of species. Their fusion reactor designs powered colonies on 300 worlds. The sudden loss of all this was already causing problems, but Kavros knew the real question was not about money or technology. It was about trust, and that was much harder to quantify. Kavros began reviewing every formal complaint humanity had filed with the Council over the past 30 years. There were hundreds of them. Most had been dismissed or filed away without serious consideration. He read through proposals for voting reform that had been rejected. He found requests for intervention in pirate attacks that had been ignored. He discovered aid requests from human colonies that had been denied because the Council deemed humans capable of solving their own problems. Each individual incident seemed small, but together they painted a disturbing picture. The breaking point appeared to be something called the Virilian incident. Kavros pulled up the full report and read it carefully. 3 months before humanity withdrew from the Council, a human research station on the edge of the frontier had been destroyed. 47 scientists and their families had died in the attack. The humans had brought evidence to the Council showing that the raiders came from the Talmar Confederacy. They had ship signatures, intercepted communications, and even debris with Talmar markings. The evidence was overwhelming. The Council had investigated, of course. They always investigated. But the Talmar were an old species with significant influence in the Council. Their representative had argued that the evidence was circumstantial and could have been planted. He suggested that pirates often use stolen ships and false markings. The Council had ultimately declined to take action against the Talmar and closed the case as unsolved. The human delegation had walked out of that session in silence. Kavros realized now that they had already made their decision in that moment. But there was something else in the records that troubled Kavros even more. For the past 5 years, human ships had been making regular trips into the outer dark. These were the unexplored regions beyond Council SP. ACE, where independent species lived without any central government. Long-range sensors had detected human vessels in at least 30 different systems out there. When questioned about it, human diplomats had simply stated they were conducting exploration and trade missions. The Council had not pressed the issue because the Outer Dark was not Council territory. Kavros began pulling sensor logs and communications intercepts from the border regions. What he found made his mandibles click together in agitation. The humans had not just been exploring. They had been building relationships. They had offered technology to species the Council considered too primitive to contact. They had negotiated trade agreements without Council oversight. They had even provided military assistance to colonies that were under attack by raiders. All of this had been happening right under the Council's censors, and nobody had paid attention. The evidence suggested that humanity had been preparing for this withdrawal for years. They had been securing alternative trade partners and building a support network outside Council space. They had been creating contingency plans and backup systems. When they finally walked away from the Council, they had somewhere to go, and that realization chilled Kavros to his core. A priority alert flashed on one of his screens. A Council patrol had intercepted a human ship just outside the border. The vessel had suffered a mechanical failure and drifted into Council space before it could complete repairs. Kavros immediately ordered the ship and crew brought to the station for questioning. This was the first human the Council had been able to reach since the withdrawal, and Kavros intended to learn everything he could. The human captain was brought to an interrogation room 2 days later. His name was Greg Hamilton, and he showed no sign of fear or concern as he sat down across from Kavros. The director began with simple questions. Why had humanity withdrawn from the Council? What were they planning to do next? Would they consider returning to negotiations? Greg answered each question with patience but revealed nothing useful. Kavros tried a different approach. He brought up the Virillion incident and asked if that had been the cause of the withdrawal. Greg leaned back in his chair and smiled. He explained that Virillion had been one incident among hundreds. He said that humanity had tried for 3 decades to be treated as equals in the Council, but had been dismissed and patronized at every turn. He told Kavros that humans were tired of being told they were too young or too emotional or too aggressive to understand how things really worked. The director pressed harder. He needed to know what humans were doing in the outer dark and whether they posed a threat to Council security. Greg's smile widened. He told Kavros that humans were doing exactly what they should have been allowed to do in the Council. They were forming partnerships with species who wanted to grow and learn. They were sharing technology with civilizations who appreciated it. They were building something new because the old system had failed them. Kavros asked the question that the entire Council wanted answered. Would humanity ever come back? Greg stood up from his chair and looked the director in the eye. He said that humanity had given the Council every chance to change, and the Council had chosen not to. He said that humans did not need the Council anymore, and the Council would have to learn to accept that. Then he said something that would haunt Kavros for months afterward. You had your chance to treat us as equals, and now you will deal with the consequences of treating us as children. The interrogation ended there because Kavros realized he would get nothing more from this human. Greg was released and his ship was repaired and allowed to return to human space. The director filed his report to the Council, but he knew it would not be well received. The truth was clear now. Humanity had not acted impulsively or emotionally. They had planned this withdrawal carefully and executed it perfectly. They had built an alternative to the Council, and they were not coming back. Reports began flooding into the intelligence office from all over Council space. Human ships were being spotted in the outer dark with increasing frequency. Construction projects were detected on previously uninhabited worlds. Species that the Council had barely made contact with were suddenly fielding advanced technology that looked suspiciously human in design. The evidence pointed to one conclusion. Humanity was building an empire of their own, and they were doing it fast. Kavros compiled all his findings into a comprehensive report and presented it to the Council emergency session. The reaction was exactly what he expected. Denial, anger, and fear in equal measure. Some representatives refused to believe that humanity could abandon them so completely. Others demanded immediate military action to force humans back to the negotiating table. A few quietly suggested that perhaps the Council had brought this on themselves. The Empress of the Zenthari demanded to know how long humanity could sustain themselves without Council support. Kavros had to tell her the truth. With the resources they controlled and the alliances they had built in the outer dark, humanity could sustain themselves indefinitely. They did not need the Council, and that changed everything about the balance of power in the galaxy. The economic collapse began slowly, and then accelerated like a ship falling into a gravity well. Within the first week after humanity's withdrawal, shipping companies across Council space reported delays and route disruptions. The efficient trade lanes that humans had mapped and maintained were now closed to Council vessels. Ships that had once made the journey from the core worlds to the frontier in 3 weeks now needed 5 or 6. Fuel costs doubled as captains were forced to take longer and more dangerous routes through unstable regions of space. The Crolian Merchant Guild held an emergency meeting in their towering headquarters on their homeworld. Representatives from 1,000 trading companies gathered to assess the damage. The numbers were worse than anyone had anticipated. Human-operated trade routes had handled 40% of all goods moving through Council space. Without those routes, cargo was piling up at ports and delivery schedules were falling apart. The Guildmaster stood before the assembly and delivered the grim news. They were looking at losses in the trillions of credits if this situation continued for more than a few months. Medical supplies became the first critical shortage. Human pharmaceutical companies had developed treatments for 17 different diseases that affected multiple species. Their manufacturing facilities produced medication that billions of beings across the galaxy depended on daily. When the humans closed their borders, those shipments stopped immediately. Hospitals on Council worlds began rationing medicine within 2 weeks. Doctors had to make impossible choices about which patients would receive treatment and which would have to wait. The Eularian hegemony faced a different crisis. Their entire power grid ran on fusion reactors built with human technology. The reactors themselves would continue running for years, but they required regular maintenance and replacement parts that only human engineers knew how to manufacture. The Eularians had always meant to train their own people on the technology, but there had never seemed to be any urgency. Now their chief engineer stood before the hegemon and explained that they had perhaps 6 months before critical systems began failing. Council representatives began pointing fingers at each other during sessions that grew more heated each day. The Xanthari blamed the Talmar for provoking the humans with the Virillian incident. The Talmar accused the Xanthari of treating younger species with arrogance and driving them away. The Crolians demanded that someone fix the economic disaster before their entire civilization collapsed. The Eularians insisted that the Council take military action to force the humans back to the table. Every species was looking out for their own interests, and the unity that had held the Council together for centuries was fracturing smaller. Member species watched the chaos and began making quiet calculations of their own. The Plevans had been part of the Council for 200 years, but they had never been given much respect or influence. Their votes were often ignored, and their proposals rarely even made it to the floor for discussion. Now they looked at the economic devastation spreading through Council space and wondered if staying was worth the cost. Their delegation began having private meetings behind closed doors. Then Ellen Baker appeared on independent news networks across the galaxy. She had been a professor of economics at the Council's most prestigious university until 3 months ago, when she had quietly resigned and disappeared. Now she sat in front of cameras and calmly explained exactly what humanity had been planning. The interview was broadcast to billions of viewers, and its impact was immediate. Ellen spoke in clear, simple terms that anyone could understand. She explained that humanity had seen this economic collapse coming for years. They had watched the Council grow complacent and inefficient. They had recognized that their withdrawal would cause chaos, and they had prepared accordingly. While the Council had dismissed human concerns and delayed reforms, humanity had been building an entirely separate economic system in the outer dark. The independent species out beyond Council borders had resources that the galaxy needed. They had raw materials and rare elements and agricultural products. What they lacked was technology and infrastructure and trade networks. Humanity had provided all of that. Over 5 years, humans had built shipyards and factories and power stations on dozens of worlds. They had shared their medical technology and their manufacturing techniques. They had created trade agreements that were fair and beneficial to all parties. Ellen smiled at the camera and delivered the line that would be quoted across the galaxy for months afterward. The Council assumed humanity needed them, but the truth was that humanity had outgrown them. The Council had become an obstacle rather than an asset, and humanity had simply moved on. She finished by noting that any species who wanted fair treatment and equal partnership knew where to find it, and that offer was not coming from the Council. The reaction was immediate. Council officials denounced Ellen as a traitor. and demanded she be arrested if she ever entered council space. But the damage was done. Her words had articulated what many smaller species had been thinking for years. The council was built to serve the interests of the old powerful civilizations, and everyone else was expected to fall in line. Within days, long-range sensors detected massive construction projects in the outer dark. Human shipyards were operating at full capacity, building vessels for themselves and their new partners. Mining operations were extracting resources from asteroid fields that the council had never bothered to explore. Agricultural colonies were producing food in quantities that rivaled anything in council space. The humans had built an entirely functional civilization outside council control, and they had done it right under everyone's noses. Trade began flowing between human space and the outer dark. Independent, freighters carried goods back and forth along routes that avoided council territory entirely. Species that had been ignored by the council for centuries suddenly had access to advanced technology and profitable markets. The economic benefits were obvious, and word spread quickly. If you wanted fair treatment and good business, you dealt with the humans and their new partners. The council attempted to establish trade embargoes and economic sanctions against both humanity and the independent species working with them. The effort failed spectacularly. Too many council members depended on goods that now only came from human space or the outer dark. Enforcing an embargo would hurt council worlds more than it would hurt their targets. The sanctions were quietly dropped after 2 weeks. The Baxtari Consortium was the first major council member to break ranks. They were a trading empire that had built their wealth on commerce, and they recognized an economic reality when they saw it. Their merchant fleet began making deals with human traders in neutral space. The transactions were kept quiet at first, but within a month everyone knew what was happening. The Baxtari were hedging their bets and preparing for a future where the council might not be the dominant. Council economists presented their projections to the leadership, and the numbers were devastating. If current trends continued, the council economy would contract by 30% within a year. Unemployment would skyrocket. Supply chains would collapse. Multiple member species would face serious hardship and possibly even famines. The council had to find a way to bring humanity back, or accept that their position as the galaxy's central authority was ending. Military hawks within the council began advocating for a more aggressive approach. They argued that humanity's withdrawal was an act of rebellion that could not be tolerated. They suggested blockading human space or launching strikes against human facilities in the outer dark. The debates grew heated, but ultimately the military option was rejected. Everyone remembered that humanity had built one of the most powerful fleets in the galaxy, and they now had dozens of allied species backing them. A war would be long and bloody, and the council might not win. The council drafted a formal message to Earth. It was carefully worded and went through 17 revisions before being approved. The message acknowledged that perhaps the council had not always treated humanity fairly. It proposed opening negotiations to address human grievances. It offered concessions on voting rights and representation. The message was sent through every available channel, and then the council waited for a response. Days passed and no answer came. The silence from human space remained absolute. The council sent follow-up messages with increasingly generous offers. Still nothing. It became clear that humanity was not interested in negotiating. They had made their choice and they were committed to it. The galaxy was changing, and the council was no longer in control of that change. 6 months after humanity closed its borders, the announcement came through every communication network in the galaxy. A new alliance had formed in the outer dark, and its name was the Independent Systems Coalition. The broadcast included a full member list, and the council members who watched it felt their mandibles and jaws and facial features drop in shock. 37 species had joined this new coalition, and humanity stood at its center as the founding member and primary architect. The species listed were ones that the council had barely acknowledged over the years. Some had applied for council membership decades ago and been rejected as too primitive or too unstable. Others had never bothered applying because they knew the council would not accept them. These were civilizations that lived on the edges of explored space, scraping by with outdated technology and limited resources. Now they had human ships in their skies and human engineers in their factories and human teachers in their schools. The broadcast included a detailed charter that outlined the coalition's principles. Every member species had equal voting rights regardless of age or size or military power. Trade agreements were negotiated fairly with terms that benefited all parties. Mutual defense pacts meant that an attack on one member was treated as an attack on all. Technology and knowledge were shared freely to raise everyone's standard of living. The contrast with council policies could not have been more obvious or more deliberate. Ambassador Kyle Rogers appeared on screen as the primary spokesman for the coalition. He was young for a diplomat with sharp eyes and a confident manner that suggested he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Kyle spoke directly to the camera, and his message was broadcast across known space in 40 different languages. He explained that the council had been given centuries to build a fair and equitable system but had instead created a hierarchy where ancient species held all power and newer members were treated as inferior. Kyle detailed humanity's experience in the council over 30 years. He spoke about proposals that were dismissed without consideration. He mentioned the Virillion incident and how the council had refused to take action when humans died because it was politically inconvenient. He talked about how human colonies had been denied aid during crises because the council decided they should handle their own problems. Each example he gave resonated with smaller council members who had experienced similar treatment. The key moment in Kyle's address came when he made an offer that would reshape galactic politics. Any species that wished to join the coalition was welcome to apply. The requirements were simple and transparent: respect for the sovereignty of other members, commitment to fair trade practices, participation in mutual defense agreements. No species would be considered more important than another, and no member would have veto power over coalition decisions. It was everything the council was not, and the appeal was immediate. The council emergency session that followed was the most chaotic in recorded history. Representatives shouted over each other trying to be heard. The Zenthari Empress demanded immediate action against what she called an illegal rival organization. The Crolian trade minister argued that they should negotiate with the coalition before things got worse. The Eularian diplomat insisted that they needed to reform council policies to prevent more defections. Nobody could agree on anything except that the situation was spiraling out of their control. Within a week, 3 smaller council species announced they were withdrawing to join the coalition. The Plevans were first, and their statement was blunt and unforgiving. They had been council members for 200 years and had never been treated with respect or given real influence. The coalition offered them something the council never had, which was equality and opportunity. Their ships began moving toward coalition space immediately. The Torvian clans followed 2 days later with a similar announcement. The Drayan Republic withdrew 3 days after that. Each departure weakened the council's position and emboldened other species who were considering their options. The trickle of defections threatened to become a flood, and council leadership knew they had to do something to stop it. Emergency reforms were proposed and pushed through with unprecedented speed. Voting rights were expanded to give smaller species more influence. Investigation procedures were revised to ensure fairness. Aid protocols were rewritten to guarantee support for colonies in crisis. The changes were substantial and would have been celebrated as historic progress if they had come 5 years earlier. Now they felt desperate and inadequate. More species announced their intention to join the coalition. Some were council members who formally withdrew. Others were independent civilizations who had watched events unfold and decided they wanted to be part of this new alliance. The coalition welcomed them all and worked quickly to integrate them into the growing network of trade and defense. Human advisors helped new members upgrade their infrastructure and train their personnel in advanced technologies. The council watched helplessly as their sphere of influence contracted week by week. Long-range sensors tracked the construction of massive facilities throughout coalition space. Shipyards capable of building hundreds of vessels. Manufacturing complexes that produced everything from medical supplies to weapon systems. Agricultural stations that could feed billions. Research centers where scientists from dozens of species worked together on projects the council had never even considered. Military analysts presented their assessments to the council leadership, and the conclusions were troubling. The coalition fleet was growing rapidly and already matched the council's navy in total tonnage. More concerning was that coalition ships incorporated the latest human technology, which was generally considered superior to council designs in most categories. The training exercises that coalition forces conducted showed impressive coordination between species that had barely known each other a year ago. There was talk among the more aggressive council members about military options. Some suggested establishing blockades around key coalition systems to strangle their economy. Others proposed surgical strikes against coalition shipyards to slow their expansion. A few even advocated for full-scale war to eliminate the threat before it grew any stronger. Each proposal was debated and ultimately rejected because the risks were too high and the chances of success too uncertain. The Zinthari Empress convened a secret meeting with the leaders of the council's most powerful species. She argued that they needed to present a united front against the coalition, or risk losing everything their ancestors had built. The Crolian representative countered that perhaps they should accept the new reality and find ways to coexist with the coalition. The Eularian hegemon suggested opening diplomatic channels to negotiate some kind of arrangement. The meeting ended without any consensus, and the divisions within council leadership became public knowledge. Public opinion across council space was shifting in ways that alarmed the establishment. News networks interviewed citizens who expressed admiration for what humanity and the coalition had accomplished. Young people talked about the coalition as a model for how galactic civilization should function. Some council worlds saw protests demanding reforms that would bring them closer to coalition principles. The idea that the council way was the only way was no longer universally accepted. Trade between council space and coalition space continued despite the political tensions. Merchants from both sides met in neutral zones to exchange goods and make deals. The economic benefits of cooperation were obvious to anyone paying attention. Coalition products were high quality and reasonably priced. Council goods had markets in coalition space, where buyers appreciated craftsmanship from older civilizations. The invisible hand of commerce was building bridges that politicians were trying to burn. Ambassador Linda Morrison gave her first interview since humanity's withdrawal from the council. She appeared calm and confident as she answered questions about coalition goals and intentions. When asked if the coalition posed a threat to the council, Linda smiled and said the coalition had no interest in threatening anyone. They simply wanted to build a better system for themselves and anyone else who wished to join them. When asked if humanity would ever rejoin the council, Linda's expression hardened. She said that ship had sailed and was never coming back. The interview concluded with Linda making a statement that would define the new era of galactic politics. She said the council had been built by ancient species to serve ancient interests, and younger civilizations had been expected to accept that arrangement forever. But the galaxy was changing and new powers were rising, and the old order would have to adapt or become irrelevant. The coalition was not trying to destroy the council, but they were certainly proving there was an alternative, and that alternative was attracting followers at an alarming rate. Council intelligence reported that coalition representatives were making contact with species deep in council territory. They were not offering bribes or making threats, but simply presenting information about coalition membership and letting species make their own choices. It was recruitment, but done so carefully that the council could not justify calling it an act of aggression. Several more species announced they were considering withdrawal, and the council seemed powerless to stop them. 1 year had passed since humanity severed all diplomatic ties with the Galactic Council, and the galaxy looked nothing like it had before. The council had lost 15 member species to the coalition, and another dozen were in active negotiations about joining. The economic dominance that the council had enjoyed for centuries was crumbling as coalition trade networks proved more efficient and more profitable. The political unity that had held the council together was fracturing as member species argued about how to respond to this new reality. The council leadership made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. They drafted a message requesting a face-to-face meeting with coalition representatives. The message acknowledged past mistakes and expressed genuine willingness to discuss a new relationship. To everyone's surprise, the coalition agreed to the meeting. A neutral station on the border between council and coalition space was selected as the location, and delegations from both sides began preparing for what might be the most important diplomatic encounter in galactic history. Ambassador Linda Morrison led the coalition delegation. She walked into the conference room with the same calm confidence she had shown a year ago when she announced humanity's withdrawal. Beside her stood representatives from a dozen coalition species. chosen to demonstrate the diversity and unity of their alliance. Across the table sat the Council's most senior diplomats, including the Zenthari Empress herself, who rarely left her throne world for any reason. The symbolism was clear. The Council was taking this seriously. The Empress spoke first, and her tone was conciliatory in a way that shocked those who knew her reputation for pride. She acknowledged that the Council had not always treated humanity and other younger species with the respect they deserved. She admitted that the Virillion incident had been handled poorly, and that many human concerns had been dismissed when they should have been addressed. She offered a formal apology on behalf of the Council and proposed opening negotiations to repair the relationship. Linda listened without interrupting, and when the Empress finished, she thanked her for the apology. Then she calmly explained why the Coalition would not be accepting it or returning to the Council. She said that the fundamental problem was not any single incident or mistake, but rather the structure of the Council itself. The Council had been designed by ancient species to maintain their power and control. Newer species were allowed to join, but always as junior members who were expected to defer to their elders. The Crowleyan representative tried to argue that the recent reforms had addressed these concerns. Voting rights had been expanded and investigation procedures had been revised. Surely these changes demonstrated the Council's commitment to equality. Linda shook her head slowly. She explained that reforms imposed from the top down after a crisis were not the same as a system built on equality from the beginning. The Council was trying to patch holes in a leaking ship when what was needed was a completely new vessel. Linda pulled up holographic displays showing the Coalition Charter and contrasted it with Council rules. In the Coalition, every member had equal voting power regardless of when they joined or how powerful they were. Decisions required majority approval with no single species having veto authority. Trade agreements were negotiated openly with terms that benefited all parties fairly. Defense commitments were mutual with no expectation that smaller species would fight battles for larger ones. These were not reforms that could be added to the Council system, because they contradicted the basic hierarchy that system was built upon. The Eularian hegemon asked directly whether the Coalition intended to replace the Council as the primary galactic authority. Linda's answer was both diplomatic and devastating. She said the Coalition had no interest in ruling the galaxy or imposing its will on others. The Council was welcome to continue governing its member species however it saw fit, but the Coalition would also continue to exist and continue to offer an alternative to species who wanted something different. The galaxy was large enough for two systems and both could coexist peacefully. But coexistence required mutual respect, and that was where Linda laid out the Coalition's terms. The Council would recognize Coalition sovereignty and territorial integrity. Both sides would respect each other's borders and trade routes. Disputes would be resolved through negotiation rather than force. Technology and information could be shared between willing parties, but neither side would interfere in the other's internal affairs. It was a framework for peaceful separation rather than reconciliation. The Zenthari Empress tried one more approach. She offered humanity a permanent seat on the Council's executive board, with veto power over major decisions. She promised that human proposals would be given priority consideration, and human colonies would receive full support in any crisis. It was an extraordinary offer that would have made humanity one of the most powerful voices in the Council. Linda declined without hesitation. She explained that humanity had learned an important lesson over the past year. Real power and real respect could not be given by others. They had to be claimed and built and defended. The Coalition had done that by creating something new, rather than trying to reform something broken. Accepting a privileged position in the Council would make humanity complicit in the same hierarchical system that had marginalized them and so many others. That was not a compromise humanity was willing to make. The meeting continued for hours as Council diplomats tried different arguments and offered different concessions. Linda and her colleagues listened politely to each proposal and rejected them all. The Coalition was not negotiating to return to the Council. They were negotiating the terms of permanent separation. By the time the meeting ended, both sides understood that the galaxy had fundamentally changed, and there was no going back to how things were. The Council delegation returned home with the bitter knowledge that they had lost. They were no longer the supreme authority in the galaxy. They were one power among two, and the balance was shifting against them with each passing month. More species would likely join the coalition in the coming years. The council would continue to exist, but its influence and reach would be diminished. The age of unquestioned council dominance was over. Linda Morrison stood in the observation deck of the coalition station and watched the council ships depart. Beside her stood Kyle Rogers and several other key coalition figures. They had won this confrontation without firing a single shot. They had proven that there was an alternative to the council system, and that alternative was viable and attractive. Species across the galaxy were watching and learning and making their own choices. Kyle asked Linda if she thought the council would eventually collapse. She considered the question carefully before answering. She said the council would probably survive in some form, because it still served the interests of its core members. But it would never again be the only game in town, and that was what really mattered. The coalition had broken the monopoly and opened up space for new possibilities. Word came through that another 3 species had applied for coalition membership. The applications would be reviewed and almost certainly approved. The coalition was growing stronger every day while the council struggled to maintain what it still had. The shift in galactic power was undeniable and irreversible. 6 months later, Admiral Greg Hamilton stood on the bridge of a newly commissioned coalition vessel named Horizon. The ship was massive and powerful, built with combined technology from a dozen species working together. Around him in space hung a fleet of similar vessels, each one crewed by personnel from different coalition worlds. It was a symbol of what they had achieved and what they intended to continue building. Greg gave the order to set course for the frontier. The coalition had secured its position in known space, but there was still vast regions of the galaxy to explore. There were new species to contact and new alliances to form. The work of building a better system was never truly finished because there was always room to grow and improve. The Horizon and its escort fleet engaged their faster-than-light drives and vanished into the darkness beyond the frontier. Behind them, the old order struggled to adapt to its diminished status. Ahead of them lay unexplored space full of possibilities. The coalition was not content to simply exist as an alternative to the council. They intended to expand and explore and demonstrate that their way of doing things could succeed on an even larger scale. Back on Earth, people watched the news reports about the fleet's departure with pride and satisfaction. Humanity had refused to accept second-class status in someone else's system and had built their own instead. They had found allies who shared their values, and together they had created something worth fighting for. The decision to sever all diplomacy with the Council had been difficult and risky, but it had worked. The Galactic Council continued to function, but it was no longer the center of galactic civilization. It was one option among others, and species were free to choose which system they wanted to be part of. Some would stay with the Council out of loyalty or self-interest. Others would join the coalition seeking equality and opportunity. The galaxy was big enough for both, and the competition between them would ultimately benefit everyone by forcing both systems to improve. Humanity had not set out to destroy the Council or conquer the galaxy. They had simply stopped accepting treatment that was beneath their dignity, and had built something better when the old system refused to change. In doing so, they had sparked a transformation that would echo across the stars for generations to come. The age of unquestioned authority was over, and the age of choice had begun.